As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. Today we have a returning guest, Michael Rivero, founder and host of WhatReallyHappened.com. Mike has had a career in Hollywood, and now he's an independent journalist living in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Michael, welcome back to Reluctant Preppers.
Well, thank you for having me today.
The reason we wanted to have you back on is to get your take on a number of topics. You were with us last year and setting us straight on a number of issues that people have uncommon common sense about, or to put it another way, just straightening out what conventional wisdom has all wrong. And now we have a different topic we'd like you to field for us. It's nearing the end of the Obama presidency. It's been a long, almost 8 years. A lot has changed, and not always for the better. We're wanting to take a rational assessment with your help, a comprehensive look at how the world has changed from the perspective of people who are concerned about security, privacy, survival, health and wellness, preparedness, stability of their family and their communities and their country and the world. And I thought if you could let me just toss out a topic at a time, and we can put together Obama's scorecard from the standpoint of preppers, and starting from a macro view of some global and national scale issues that are of vital importance to risk or health of our world and nation, and then taking it right down to the individual family where we live. So are you game for that?
Absolutely.
All right, so let's, with your help, let's put together Obama's prepper scorecard. So first at the macro level, are we better or worse off? Are we safer or more at risk than we were at the beginning of the Obama regime? First topic, global economic stability. Is the world more stable economically on a global basis now or less than it was at the beginning of the Obama administration?
Well, absolutely not. And part of that has to do with the fact that the model of private central banking, which has been imposed on pretty much the entire planet, is an unstable system. It is naturally unstable because it produces more debt than money with which to pay the debt, until the debt overwhelms the entire system and locks it up, which is what we're seeing happening here in the United States of America, in Asia, all across Europe. And it is a problem. Private central banking is set up to enrich the owners of the banks at the expense of the people, but it can't last forever. Sooner or later, the debt builds to the point where the system comes crumbling down. Now, in the past, when individual nations with private central banks hit that crash point, the other nations with private central banks would pour in and restart the system all over again. But today, because of economic globalism, it looks like the entire system could come down all at one time. And in the long run, that's a good thing because it gives us the opportunity to stand up as a people and say, no more private central banks. We want to go back to the economic model that worked for the new United States. Government-issued public currency managed as a public utility and not a privatized for-profit operation.
And we've also heard from some other guests that this is maybe the first time, or is the first time in history, that all the nations of the world have currencies that are based on nothing but debt, just fiat. And also the Eurozone described as just a set of dominoes ready to fall, with the most wobbly ones that people are familiar with, whether it's Greece or Turkey or whoever on the one end, ready to take the rest down. So.
Well, actually, right now, all eyes are focused on Deutsche Bank because right now Deutsche Bank is running something like $260 billion into the red. Technically, they're already insolvent, but they're being propped up and allowed to continue because there's a huge derivatives nightmare tangled up in that. And unfortunately, all of these private central banks and their servile governments have been doing whatever they could think of to keep the system going: bail-ins, bailouts, TARP, quantitative easing, negative interest rates. But they've pretty much run out of tricks at this point. And the net result is that confidence in the public in the banking systems has been eroded to a very high degree by seeing all the rigging that's been going on, whether it's LIBOR, gold and silver prices, and people are basically becoming banking heretics because banking is not a science. It's actually operating like a religion, where there's an arbitrary set of beliefs and rules that you are indoctrinated with to make you think this is the way the world is supposed to be, and it's set up to benefit the clergy, meaning the owners of these private central banks. And they've been playing this scam on planet Earth for about 300 years, and it looks like we could be on the verge of seeing the whole thing come crashing down.
So that was topic one, global economic stability. Topic number two, global political stability. Is the world better off or worse from a global political stability standpoint than it was 8 years ago?
Well, from the point of view of the United States, it is definitely much worse because the world is now aware that all of these U.S. incursions to all these other countries had nothing to do with democracy and freedom or freeing the nation from an evil tyrant. It's all come down to purely economic motives. And the reason for that actually goes back to the end of World War II, where Roosevelt's price to Winston Churchill to bring the U.S. into the war against Nazi Germany was that Britain's pound sterling would surrender its role as the global trade and banking currency and allow the dollar to take over. Churchill was eventually forced to agree to that, and that's when Roosevelt goaded the Japanese into the attack on Pearl Harbor to get the American people into these wars. And as the war was winding down, the representatives of the major economic powers got together at a luxury resort up in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, and they hammered out the Bretton Woods Agreement, which made the dollar the global trade and banking currency. And the U.S. economic system made a huge profit off of that because before anybody could do any commerce across a border, they had to first come to the United States of America and either borrow Federal Reserve notes at interest, or they had to bring us manufactured goods or agricultural produce in exchange for stacks of ink and paper. And much of the post-war prosperity that the United States experienced was because of this. And over the decades, our economic system and political system became very lazy. They had all this money coming in, guaranteed flow. They allowed our manufacturing to decline in quantity and quality. And nobody wants to buy our agricultural exports because of the GMO problem right now. So the U.S. is now dependent on the income that it gets from the world being forced to use the U.S. dollar. And as a result, anytime a country tries to break away from that, war is the inevitable result. And I'll give you two examples. In 2002, Iraq got permission from the United Nations to sell Iraq's oil for the euro. 1 year later, screaming nuclear weapons of mass destruction, the U.S. invaded Iraq, killed Saddam Hussein, and put Iraq's oil back on the world market, but only for the U.S. dollar. Down in Libya, you had Muammar Gaddafi, which everybody said he was doing a great job for the Libyans, and then all of a sudden he kicks out Libya's private central bank. He establishes a state bank and a value-based currency, the gold dinar. Then he announces to the rest of the world that Libya's oil is for sale, but only for the gold dinar. The U.S. invades Libya, kills Gaddafi, sets up a new private central bank. The gold for the gold dinar is vanished, and Libya's oil is back on the world market only for the U.S. dollar. And we are seeing this same pattern being repeated in country after country after country. Back in 2013, the European Union was trying to woo Ukraine to merge with the European Union and move under the slavery of the European Central Bank. Ukraine said, no, actually, Russia's making a better deal. So the U.S. goes in early 2014 with a covert coup d'etat, drives the legitimate government of Ukraine out of power, and installs a junta centered around Poroshenko, which has led to civil war and much suffering all across the country. Poroshenko, of course, obediently is dragging the Ukraine into the European Union. So it's all being driven by money and whose currency everybody is supposed to use for the next 100 years.
And other, if you could speak just a moment about the strength of our U.S. allies and alliances specifically, the loyalty that, the strength of and character of the loyalty that we enjoy, the goodwill of our allied nations now versus 8 years ago.
Well, that is eroding rapidly. First of all, Russia, 8 years ago, Russia was everybody's friend, a friend of the U.S. We were doing business across our borders. Obviously, Russia is being set up to be the enemy. We're seeing constant propaganda. They're trying to basically take us back to the Cold War era of the 1950s and 1960s, where they just shout Russians at us and we will wet ourselves and fling our money and our babies onto the enemy's bayonets here. It's not really getting a lot of traction. There's a great deal of concern over the fact that many of the countries in the European Union are very tired of the economic harm they're suffering under U.S.-backed sanctions. They're petitioning their own government to say that this is let the U.S. do what it wants to do, but Europe really does not want to get involved in the middle of a conflict being created by the United States against Russia, because if it does explode into a new world war, which is a real possibility, once again, Europe will be a major battleground. And if you travel around Europe today, you can still see the scars from World War I and World War II. They don't want to have that again.
Now, we can't move away from the topic of political stability without talking about the rise of ISIS and the huge outflux of refugees around the world from that. And in your opinion, is the U.S. demonstrating appropriate strength in dealing with the rise of ISIS, or what's actually the reality of that?
Absolutely not. And the reason is that ISIS, like al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, is actually a covert proxy for the United States. And a lot of this got revealed from the emails coming out of the Benghazi investigation and the classified U.S. government's documents that the U.S. Supported the creation of ISIS in order to use it as a proxy in the Middle East. And I'll give you a very good example. The U.S. has been trying to get Bashar al-Assad out of Syria for 5 years now, and what they were doing is they sent ISIS and al-Qaeda in there, and they went in and started bombing, saying, oh, we're fighting the terrorists, ISIS and al-Qaeda. But they kept missing ISIS and al-Qaeda and bombing critical Syrian economic infrastructure. Syria has suffered billions of dollars in losses from U.S. bombing. And, of course, the Russians come on in at the invitation of the Syrian government, something the United States does not have, and showed very quickly that had the U.S. really wanted to go after the terrorists, they would not have lasted very long. And now the U.S.-backed terrorist groups are basically down to their last stronghold in Aleppo, and the U.S. is desperate to regain the initiative in Syria, which is why we have Saudi Arabian and British and U.S. troops literally on the border of Syria ready to launch a ground invasion.
Before we leave the global scene, wanting to also talk about medical risks or health risks. There was quite a scare a year or so ago about Ebola. Now they're talking about the Zika virus, and there's been plenty of talk about toxins in the environment. Are we, as a global community, as a global residents of planet Earth, are we better or worse off from medical risks now than we were 8 years ago?
It's kind of hard to say how bad the real risk is. The real change has been that more and more people are becoming aware of the fact that our medical industrial complex is driven, again, by money and is actually unconcerned with the real health of the population. In fact, the sicker we are, the more money that they make. And there's a tremendous concern over this rush for mandated vaccinations, which are huge moneymakers for these corporations. Some of them are simply not effective. Some of them are actually causing the disease they're supposed to be protecting against. Some of them are causing other harm completely. Japan has pretty much shut down Gardasil because of all the young girls who have suffered permanent harm from that one. But here in the United States of America, because our government is so deeply in debt and broke, their attitude seems to be anything that makes money is good, anything that gets in the way of that is bad. And as a result, concern and care for ordinary people is just not there anymore. And I think the water situation in Flint, Michigan illustrates that perfectly. General Motors factory in Flint got a clean water hookup because the tap water was actually etching the metal in the engine blocks that they were manufacturing. But that same water is what was coming out of the taps going into the children. And the damage from that water is permanent and irreversible. But the attitude was, hey, we got to save money somewhere, and we're just not going to. We don't have the money for safe, clean drinking water. We've got to spend it on wars and propping up Wall Street and propping up Israel. And by the way, this issue is not confined just to Flint, Michigan. British media not too long ago said that they had documents showing that heavy metal content of tap water in every major city east of the Mississippi was being concealed. and underreported. Now, that doesn't mean the west half of the United States is necessarily safe. It's just the documents the British media had were only for cities in the eastern part of the United States. But we know they've had a toxic water scandal up in Ohio, parts of New Orleans, Baltimore, and Boston. It's everywhere. And over at my website and radio show, we've been encouraging people to buy a tap water testing kit of their own. They run about $20, and it allows you to test your water for lead content, pesticides, all sorts of things, and you can find out if your water is really safe to drink or not. And remember, all of this feeds into the plan to turn water into a commodity. And it wasn't, I think, more than a year ago, the CEO of Nestle declared that water is not a right for people, that it should be owned by corporations and commoditized. And as you know, Nestle has this huge scandal going on out in California where they are just sucking huge amounts of water out of one of the few remaining safe aquifers. And they're doing it on the basis of a permit that expired years ago. That's in court. But Nestle sucks out California's water, puts it in bottles, and sells it back to the California people for $2, $3 a bottle, as opposed to what they were paying for it to just have coming out of their tap in their homes all along. And it's a serious problem. And obviously, Nestle would like our tap water all across the country to be unsafe to drink. Because that way they make more money. The situation in California is complicated by the fact that 2 of the state's largest aquifers have now become contaminated by fracking fluid. And the shortage of clean, safe water is so bad out there, they're starting to irrigate crops in the farms using the fracking contaminated water. And nobody has really taken a good look at those fracking chemicals, how deep into the food they penetrate. But it's just a reckless disregard for health and safety in the quest to get another buck.
Yeah, that's another thing that always strikes me is as certain types of cancers, especially breast cancer and others, are on the rise, people don't seem to be, they're racing around for the cure supposedly, but they don't seem to be asking, wait a minute, what changed? What happened here? What's different? And answering some of those questions that may be more obvious once we just look at the things that we're being exposed to. Just for you reluctant preppers, just a note that in the last year, our family put in not only a whole house activated carbon water filter, but also a reverse osmosis 5-stage filter. We can talk about more about that and even show you photos of it in a future episode. But I'm glad you brought up the thing about water access and water safety. And now bringing it down to the domestic scale, how about you?
Well, can I have a comment to make, though.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, where we're seeing all these organizations, we're seeking a cure for cancer, we're seeking a cure for AIDS, No, they actually are not. Nobody wants a cure. A cure is bad business. What they want are treatments. If you have a case of the creeping blorch and I cure you, you'll pay me that one time and then you are gone. But if you have the creeping blorch and I am giving you month-to-month treatments, then you are a permanent source of revenue. And the pharmaceutical industries aren't really interested in curing anything. What they want, what the big money thing is constant, ongoing treatments for the rest of your life.
Just in the last month, I've had one doctor prescribe me a ongoing treatment that would be $300 a month, and now a second doctor prescribed me something that would be $700 a month. And I can hear exactly what you're saying, because neither one really results in complete healing and health.
No, if everybody in America was perfectly healthy, the medical industrial complex would collapse overnight. They are dependent on us being chronically ill, whether it's from poisoned tap water, chemicals in our food, reactions to GMOs and vaccines. They absolutely are dependent on us being constantly ill with something that they can sell us a product. And sometimes they make stuff up. The guy who came up with the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, shortly before he passed away, he went public and said, it's a fictitious disease. It doesn't really exist. It was created to sell pills to parents to give to their children.
There's a whole bunch more information available about that. I think we're going to have our off-grid physician on in a few weeks, guys, to talk about connections between nutrition, the toxins in the environment, and such things as attention deficit or what may be misdiagnosed in many cases. But so stay tuned for that. And Mike, if we could bring you to the national scale now, we've been talking about global issues up to now. How about U.S. border security? Is our country and the borders of our country more or less secure now than we were 8 years ago?
Oh, they're far less secure. I mean, the Obama administration has a policy of just opening the borders and allowing everybody to pour across. We've got a huge illegal immigrant problem. They're being deliberately spread out over the entire country to make it that much harder to collect them all together. And we're not really sure what the agenda is. Certainly, it's a new source of very cheap, below minimum wage labor for industry to use. Most of them are presumed to be voting Democratic. But they're being allowed in carrying contagious diseases. That certainly helps the medical industrial complex. We've had scabies, HIV, H1N1. A couple of actual cases of plague came in with some of these illegal immigrants. And, possibly Zika is coming in, although that one may be a little bit overplayed. To sell medications. If you remember back in 2009, the swine flu, and we were calling it the when pigs fly flu because the virus turned out to be a combination of human, avian, and porcine DNA. And we actually found a paper from the CDC where they'd been making this thing 2 years before it showed up. And they lowered the threshold for a pandemic to declare the 2009 swine flu this incredible pandemic. And they said everybody has to go out and buy Tamiflu. And Roche Pharmaceuticals, which owned Tamiflu, made a huge fortune. And in the end, it turned out the 2009 swine flu was actually less serious than the regular seasonal flu. And studies done in Britain proved that Tamiflu was no more effective against the flu than over-the-counter acetaminophen. It's just all about making the money with fear-mongering. And Zika may be the same because this claim that Zika is responsible for the microcephaly in Brazil is being disputed, and rather convincingly.
Now, turning our attention to still at the national level to the economic threat level, we've certainly seen a dramatic rise in the national debt over the past administration, and we keep hearing about derivatives exposures of these too big to fail brokerage houses and that sort of thing domestically, as well as but reassuring words about, but don't worry, your stock market valuation is good and your real estate valuations are up there, so things are, happy days are here again. But what's really going on with the U.S. economic threat level? Are we better off or worse off than we were 8 years ago?
Oh, we're much worse off. We're much, much worse off. But then we've always been headed in this direction. And this goes back to what I said earlier in the program about private central banks being naturally unstable because by design they produce more debt than money with which to pay the debt until the debt swamps the system. Now, the stock market being used as a propaganda banner goes all the way back to the Bill Clinton administration when they established the President's Special Working Group on the Markets, which is known more commonly as the Plunge Protection Team. And they would basically go on in there with tons of instant money provided by the Federal Reserve and keep the market climbing upward so that Bill Clinton could wave that around and say, see, the economy is doing really good. We've got this high stock market, and if you're hungry and jobless and everything, it's got to be your own fault. And meanwhile, of course, he was plundering the Social Security Trust Fund to come up with his federal budget surplus, which is why Social Security is in trouble today. But the market was hideously overvalued. The short sellers were being just absolutely creamed by all this chicanery. I mean, what the Plunge Protection Team is doing would be a crime for anybody else. What's happening right now today is that everybody has come to understand that the stock market is being rigged. And the old investor wisdom of the trend is my friend has been abandoned, and people are now selling the rallies. Every time the Plunge Protection Team shoves the market up, everybody's saying, okay, this is a good time for me to start getting out. And they're bailing. There's a huge surge of demand for physical investment metals, silver and gold. Nobody wants the paper contracts. They're already leveraged 500 to 1. And what has happened is the economy, again, it's naturally unstable, and they've run out of tricks by which they can appear to be in control. But you're absolutely right. The corporate media is saying, look, it's all fine. There's a recovery. Earlier this week, they came out with this idea that the unemployment number is down around 5%. And that is a flat-out, absolute lie. There are almost 100 million people in the United States of America willing and able to work who have not been able to find jobs for years. But they are put in a separate category from the recently unemployed. And that's how the government can go from 100 million jobless Americans to a 5% unemployment rate. They're basically cooking the books, is what they're doing, so that they can go on reassuring the public everything is just hunky-dory.
Now, equally serious is the viability of the U.S. Constitution and how it's been upheld or trampled in the past 8 years. There was a lot of concern from the during the prior administration, during the Bush administration, about the so-called Patriot Act being a great reduction in actual personal rights and liberty, trampling on some of the Bill of Rights. So what has happened in this past administration, the Obama administration, about our constitutional rights?
Well, again, we're seeing the government just openly violating our protections under the Constitution. And again, they were doing it all along. The NSA spy scandal actually has its roots all the way back in the 1980s with a program called Echelon, or Five Eyes, which was a group of 5 nations got together, and they evaded their own government's laws against spying on their own citizens by spying on each other's citizens and then trading the information. They don't even bother with that kind of deception anymore. It's just out there. We're spying on everything you're doing. It's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. And my position is very simply, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is the original contract with America. It's the rules under which we, the people, allow the government to act as a caretaker of our national sovereignty. And if the government isn't playing by the rules, then it's not a legal, legitimate government. And a lot of people are coming to that same conclusion, and especially in New Hampshire, where we've had this absolute, fully on display election rigging taking place here, where Bernie Sanders won the popular vote, and yet somehow Hillary Clinton came out of New Hampshire with more delegates than Bernie did. And everybody is now looking at this and saying, okay, we're being told that we no longer have any control over our government. Why then are we somehow responsible for that government's out-of-control spending?
Now, further on the topic of constitutional rights, if you can talk a little bit about specific actions that have been taken during this last administration that have in clear violation of balance of powers or appropriate roles of police or upholding or enforcing the law selectively. Is there specific examples you can give us that really drive that point of whether our constitutionality of our government is being maintained or not?
Well, I think one of the most obvious examples is Obama's use of the executive order as an instrument for creating policy from his desk. And it didn't start with him. We were seeing it back in the Clinton administration. In fact, there was sort of an inside joke at the White House, stroke of the pen, law of the land, pretty cool. But you need to understand that the constitutional purpose of an executive order is to execute the will of the Congress. That's why it's called the executive branch. And an executive order is technically only binding on agencies of the executive branch, Department of State, Department of Justice, and so forth, in order to implement the laws of Congress. Now, Congress has actually allowed the president to get away with using executive orders for purposes that it was never intended to, such as revising and changing Obamacare from Obama's desk when that is actually the province of the Congress to do. That's just one example. The continuing erosion of our rights to privacy, the allowance of the police to just go on out and do warrantless searches of our cars, the NSA's intrusion into our lives, the spyware that's now built into every electronic device. Clearly, our government has taken the attitude of the Constitution shouldn't apply to them anymore. It's just getting in the way. If you'll remember, George W. Bush was caught with that comment about the Constitution being a blankety-blank piece of paper. That really is the prevailing attitude. In fact, not too long ago, the FBI actually produced a pamphlet to distribute to police departments on how to spot potential terrorists. And one of the criteria in there to declare somebody a potential terrorist was anybody talking about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights as the ultimate law of this land. So we're in a situation where the government is not only ignoring the Constitution, they have become hostile to it and to those of us who still think the Constitution applies today.
Now that leads into the next question about domestic civil stability. We've seen summer after summer, and it seems like every quarter of the year now we've got another riot in a different city in the U.S. about often these they're propagated as racially biased or racially based, but we see President Obama weighing in a very lopsided manner on these issues. We see the Justice Department being deployed in a very lopsided manner. We see the press reporting, even using the terminology that they use when they talk about suspected perpetrators or victims it seems to be racially skewed. And we also see injections of militarized police forces and talk about how this is necessary at the same time that there's aspersions being cast about the trustworthiness of police forces. It seems sometimes to the average observer that there's almost an intentional buildup of tensions towards people expecting that there's going to be martial law or martial involvement in things and pitting people against their own law enforcement or against each other. Is this just an illusion, or is this what's actually happening? And is it?
No, this is what's going on here. I mean, for any government that is abusing and exploiting its people, the one thing they're most afraid of is all the people uniting together in opposition to the government. And so divide and conquer is a very common tool of domestic statecraft, and it's certainly nothing new. If you go back and you study the history of the FBI's COINTELPRO program of the 1960s, and you will find that the FBI was going on out and deliberately creating racial tension in order that the black people and white people would be screaming at each other rather than uniting together in opposition to the war in Vietnam. One of the most notable stories to come out of that was the Black Panther coloring book. Now, the Black Panthers, when they originally started, they were all about making sure ghetto children were getting a healthy breakfast so they could go to school, and they wanted local control of the curriculum, which even back then the federal government was out there saying, no, we'll decide what your children need to know. We're following the Prussian model of education. And it came out when the lid was blown off COINTELPRO in the 1970s. It turned out the FBI had put out that coloring book, and it was filled with these horrible racist images of black people killing white police officers, and it wound up being distributed to white neighborhoods. When I living with my parents in West Covina, we got one in the mail. And we were living in a neighborhood that had almost no black people. And I was, why are we getting this thing? And as it turned out, we were the target audience. The goal was to get white people suspicious and afraid and angry with the black people, so we would stop listening to some of the legitimate grievances of the civil rights movement, including the fact that blacks were predominantly put on those front lines out in Vietnam. But this kind of divide and conquer situation is a regular tool of the government, whether it's blacks against the whites, men against women. They did that in the 1990s, and they're trying to revive that again to support Hillary Clinton. Young against the old. It's constantly trying to keep society fragmented and at angst with each other, so we can't unite together as a single people and stand up and say, you know something, our problems are all coming out of Washington, D.C. and Wall Street. It's time to fire them. And so, yeah, they were trying to fan up the racial tension to keep us divided against ourselves, to give politicians something they could campaign on that wasn't the wars of the economy. But at one point, it almost seemed like there was this push to try and create a situation that would lead to the martial law that you're talking about. And there were a couple of incidents that looked like they were setups to try and get martial law. The first one was Adam Kokesh when he was going to do his armed march into Washington, D.C. That fell apart, though. Nobody wanted to sign up for that. And then you remember the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman case, and it went to trial, and the whole week before the verdict came back, the corporate media was all about, oh, there are going to be race riots in cities all across America. It's going to be just like the Rodney King riots, only right in your neighborhood. And they were just fanning the flames of fear. And then Zimmerman was acquitted, and nothing happened because the black people and the white people both recognized a setup when they saw it. And there were some pictures of violence out in Los Angeles that were obviously staged. I remember one picture where there's this black guy throwing a trash can through the window of a store, and it's a brand new trash can from the hardware store, had never seen garbage in it. And the reason they had to do that is because the trash cans that are on the streets of Los Angeles are bolted to the pavement. So they had to bring their own to stage this photograph. And sometimes, I think Americans are only just now waking up to just how much the government and the corporate media lie to us all to get our obedience, to get our money, to get the lives of our children for their wars of conquest.
Turning to the economic health of U.S. states and cities, we've been talking about both global and national, but what's it like at the state level or at the city level in the United States? Are our states and our cities in better shape or worse shape than they were 8 years ago?
Much worse shape because, first of all, federal funding for infrastructure maintenance has been cut off. We're literally living in a wartime economy. They don't want to admit it, but that's what's going on. As the economy has slowed down and people are losing their jobs, local and state tax revenues obviously are in decline. But behind that, there's been another situation, and that is that over the last 15 years, the federal government is taking tax revenues out of the states, but it's returning less and less, along with the unfunded mandates. You know, we order you, the state, to do this, and you're going to have to pay for it. And what this has done is transfer some of the federal government's debt onto the states to try and hide the true scale of the problem. And now, of course, those states are dealing with that accumulated debt, no revenue with which to deal with it. Here in Hawaii, they're talking about the state being bankrupt by the end of the year. And again, it all goes back to that model of private central banking that creates more debt than money with which to pay that debt until the system locks up. And that's exactly what we're all going through right now.
Now, you mentioned U.S. roads, infrastructure, that sort of thing. What other aspects of the U.S. infrastructure are we in better shape or worse shape than we were 8 years ago? Again,
we're in worse shape because infrastructure is being neglected, whether it's the water system in Flint, Michigan, the aqueducts out in California. They're cracked and leaking fresh drinking water into areas that don't really need it in the terms of millions of gallons. We know that they're having problems with the Indian Point nuclear reactor is leaking tritium into their groundwater. Hanford is a major environmental disaster from the radiation. Same thing with WIPP. We know that when the Deepwater Horizon accident happened, the Minerals Management Service had been ignoring the fact that the manual blowout preventer on that well was 4 years overdue for maintenance. They were just looking the other way because the oil companies didn't want to spend the money to keep the safety systems up to date. And this kind of neglect, sooner or later, it catches up with you, where the trains are going to start falling off the tracks, the power system's going to become unreliable, and the cracks are starting to merge together. And when they do, you're going to see like major sections of our entire system blowing out.
If you could talk to us a little bit about the environment and the food supply. You did mention GMOs just in passing a little while ago, but in the safety and healthfulness of the food supply as far as a help to our families' well-being and long-term health, or as a risk, are we better or worse off than we were at the beginning of the Obama years?
We're definitely worse off here because we're seeing the biotech giants like Monsanto pursuing a policy of trying to bring all world food production under their direct control, just like the U.S. Financial system under Bretton Woods wanted everybody to have to come and use the U.S. dollar. Monsanto's goal is for anybody in the world who wants to grow food to have to buy seeds from them. And this is why they have been so incredibly reckless with their GMO products. They actually want contamination of the natural varieties, and it's caused huge economic damage for growers in the United States of America who think they're growing natural organic crops, and then they export it to a country like China, which bans GMO, and the shipment is turned around because they'll run a lab test on it and they say, no, this is genetically modified. And Monsanto's official position is that if you have a 10-yard barren barricade around your GMO field, it's perfectly safe. And that's nonsense, because we had an incident about a year and a half, 2 years ago, where wheat farmers in Oregon discovered their wheat had been contaminated by a non-approved GMO pollen that had blown in from test fields several states away. Now, they do a lot of that testing here in Hawaii, under the idea that if something pops out of the garden that starts eating the tourists, we're out here in Hawaii and there's some reasonable safeguard against its getting back to the mainland. But that's absolute nonsense when you remember that when the first humans showed up here in Hawaii, it was already covered with trees and flowers and plants and birds. We're not biologically isolated from the rest of the planet.
And adding insult to injury, I've heard, following on the story that you talked about, where non-GMO producers who have complained that their crops were contaminated with GMO, actually getting sued by the GMO producing companies for royalties and license fees for using their GMO technology, which the farmers had absolutely no intention or interest in doing, actually. So first we'll attack and contaminate your crops, and then we'll sue you for using our technology against your own will.
Well, again, as part of global domination, I think this explains why the courts went along with this absurd argument. When GMO passes from a field where it's wanted to a field where it's not wanted, it should be treated as an industrial accident and a contamination and a pollution. But the courts have been going along with these biotech companies saying, well, they're using our technology without our permission, we're going to sue them. And the courts are saying, yep, that's absolutely the case here, even though they didn't want it. And as a result, a lot of small farms are being absorbed by these giant agricultural corporations piecemeal from all these lawsuits.